this is not a fair negotiation. He's not negotiating. He's just saying, I'm going to go have sex with someone else. When you take BDSM too seriously, when you forget that it's play, then you're high on your own supply, and you're believing in the myth that you are telling too much.
A healthy masculine man would be direct, would ask for what he wants, and then be okay with whatever answer comes back. Our question today comes from Sarah, who writes that her dom told her that he could have sex with someone if he wanted, and she couldn't say no. Sarah responded that if he wanted to sleep with another woman, she would have to be involved in some way, and it would have to integrate into their existing dynamic. Her dom's response to this was that their dominant-submissive dynamic and relationship wasn't an equal partnership, so he would not have to ask her or involve her unless he wanted to for his own gratification. Sarah decided to end things and asks if she had done the right thing or if she's somehow broken the rules of the DS dynamic.
No, she did the right thing. I mean, she didn't break any rules. He broke the rules. If this was not a negotiated thing, this is not a fair negotiation. He's not negotiating. He's just saying, I'm going to go have sex with someone else. So in that context, it is cheating. That's not kink. That's cheating by definition. It doesn't have to involve sleeping with someone else. There are a lot of ways to cheat a DS dynamic. For instance, if a dominant gets lazy and doesn't enforce a rule that he's made, that's cheating a DS dynamic. That wasn't the negotiation. That's not our contract. Our contract is that the sub's going to follow these rules and the dom's going to enforce them. And cheating is breaking the contractual agreement almost in any form. Now, this is one form, is that he decided he's going to have sex with other people. That's not what she's okay with, and thus the contract is broken and violated. I think it's important to frame that the dominant-submissive dynamic exists in a context of consent, in a context of an agreement of some kind, and that agreement, like any agreement, is better and better the more specified it is. The more general it is of just, oh, well, I'll be dominant, you'll be submissive, the more you run into random trouble. This is an extreme example, but this is why limit negotiation, boundary negotiation is so important. The other thing that occurs to me is he's kind of high on his own supply. He's bought into the play of dominance a little too much. It reminds me, one of my favorite books is Dune, and a quote from that book is, "Greatness is a transitory experience. It is never persistent. It depends in part upon the myth-making imagination of humankind. The person who experiences greatness must have a feeling for the myth he is in. He must reflect what is projected upon him, and he must have a strong sense of the sardonic. This is what uncouples him from belief in his own pretensions. The sardonic is all that permits him to move within himself. Without this quality, even occasional greatness will destroy a man."
Explain what the word sardonic means here.
Grimly mocking or cynical. In this context, at least, having a sense that the myth isn't real. You're able to mock the myth a little bit, taking the myth as a bit satirical even to yourself. So being able to feel that your submissive is projecting this myth of greatness upon you in some sense, but being able to be a little cynical, to know that that's not real, to know that you're not literally able to do anything you want. Yes, it's an unequal partner. I mean, the inequality is a fundamental aspect of a dom-sub relationship. It's asymmetric. That's the appeal. But you have to have a little bit of cynicism about the fact that it's play. The term I use in the book is the twilight of the half-real. And when you take something too seriously, when you forget that it's play, when you forget that it is not real, then you're high on your own supply, and you're believing in the myth that you are telling too much. It's no longer exploring, it is just going to live in the shadow. You're not venturing into the shadow to discover and then coming back to your whole self to reintegrate. You're just going to live in the shadow, and that's also not the point.
Another alternative explanation is this individual, the dom, knows exactly what he's doing and is perhaps trying to leverage the dynamic to get a little bit more than what was agreed upon and negotiated, right? So it could be that he is abusing the situation. He's like, well, I'm getting all this other stuff. Can I just get a little bit more? And he tries to push the boundaries, hoping that once the fence is moved a few meters, his submissive would be okay with where she ends up, which again is a sign of an abusive personality. So could this be coming from a place of ignorance where he just doesn't understand that this all has to be pre-negotiated and consented to? Or is it that he does understand all of that very explicitly and decides to... Because, when you have a submissive, you have someone under you that is making herself very vulnerable. And there are people out there that will look at that vulnerability and says, well, how far can I push this? How much can I get away with? And that fundamentally gives me a sense that this is where that whole toxic masculinity label is quite apt. A good example of a toxic dominant.
I don't know that I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's toxic, but I think that this is a failure of masculinity. I think that in some ways
a version of masculinity that's quite malignant, I suppose.
It comes off a bit feminine to me. Sneakiness, to me, coming at something sideways is a submissive thing to do, rather than being like, hey, this is what I want. How do you feel about this? How would you feel about this? What can we negotiate? Let's have a direct, straightforward, honest, logical conversation. That to me is masculine. That is yang energy. Yin energy is, and I've talked about this, I think there's a very positive aspect to manipulation in a relationship from the woman. There's something feminine about the notion that, hey, I'm submissive, I'm smaller and weaker, and so I'm going to flirt with you to get what I want. I'm going to tease and manipulate. There are positive aspects to manipulation because that's yin energy. That's the yin power in some sense. It's sideways because it has to be. She's smaller. She's submissive. Sure. There aren't those options. So that's why this comes off as a bit effeminate to me. Why is he being manipulative and sneaky about this and trying to sneak in an extra agreement to an existing contract rather than... And he's doing that by leveraging... And we should clarify this for people. Like, I'm saying sneaking here, and it seems like, well, wait, he said this is what he's going to do. Whatever. What's sneaky about that? Well, what's sneaky about that is he's using the frame within the Dom-Sub agreement to try to leverage additional things into that frame. When they first set up the relationship, they negotiated as equals until she submitted to an agreed contract. In that agreement, she agreed to follow his lead. Now he's trying to incorporate more things into that agreement using the leverage from within the agreement. And that's the sneakiness. Rather than toxic masculinity, this just comes off as a bit manipulative and effeminate to me.
I totally agree with your point. I think what I was getting at is when people on forums or feminists describe the term toxic masculinity, it's this kind of behavior they're pointing to.
Sure.
And, what you're saying that ironically is that, no, that's actually feminine behavior, right? Which again, the feminists their heads would explode hearing that. But your point is taken. You're basically saying a healthy masculine man would be direct, would ask for what he wants, and then be okay with whatever answer comes back. He can't be further manipulative or angry. For example, he may want to have a third, and she says, you can have a third under these circumstances, and he's not okay with that answer. He's like, no, I want to have sex without you.
Sure.
You don't need to get involved unless I say you're involved. And so he's not okay with the answer, and him not being okay and being manipulative regardless is what you're saying is very unmasculine of him.
Yeah. The important thing about that is there is the existing dynamic as it is, that they got to that agreement through some pathway, some discussion, some negotiation occurred in order to get to that agreement. That same method has to be applied to adaptations to the agreement. Meaning, if they've already agreed to a 24/7 Dom-Sub agreement with free use or something, then he's totally free to use her freely and to say, hey, this is our agreement. We already negotiated the boundaries. So this attitude makes sense within the agreement. It does not make sense when he's traversing to a boundary outside that agreement. In the book, I actually define toxic masculinity when the yin-yang symbol, right? The white and black always have a dot of the opposite in them. Without that dot, it becomes toxic. without the ability to step outside and ask, which to me is the yin kind of framing, then masculinity does become toxic in some sense. It's the limits of this masculinity. It's all white, but there's this dot of dark, or it's all black and there's this dot of white. And that dot is the thing in both cases that makes it non-toxic. Similarly, in the feminine, like I said, I think manipulation can be a very positive thing in a submissive framework. But if it's manipulative in a toxic way, then it becomes a problem, because sometimes a sub needs to be able to have a direct conversation and say, hey, this is what it is, not try and flirt her way into something that's outside the agreement. If she's trying to flirt and trying to get you to do something that wasn't part of the agreement, now this is toxic femininity, rather than that dot of yang saying, okay, now is the time for a direct conversation.